Welcome, Professor. You may have heard me say on other occasions, but if I say it again to you about your audience, there's a limited audience here in Aldwych House. Those in front of you are participants, core participants and others. And to your left, there are lawyers representing the various interests. At the back, there are members of the inquiry staff and representatives of the press. But really, your audience is beyond this room. It is a large audience, I should say. I don't mean any disrespect to this audience, of course. How could I? But the larger audience is out there somewhere watching on YouTube or live stream, around about 100 probably today, and they will be interested to know what you have to say. Ms. Fraser-Button will be asking the questions.
Thank you.
I think we need to have Professor Armstrong sworn.
Of course. Sorry, I've forgotten about that too. I'm having a very good afternoon, am I?
Please state your full name.
David Armstrong.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Before we start, I think it's worth just highlighting at this point that this afternoon we will only be addressing the part of the Public Health Administration Expert Group report that deals with NHS medical records. The rest of the report will be explored by a full panel, including yourself, Professor Armstrong, on the 3rd and 4th of October.
Yes.
So this afternoon is just a limited slot in relation to one part of the report.
Yes, well, I'm very much looking forward to both events.
Professor Armstrong, could you first of all just introduce yourself and tell us a little about your background?
I'm a professor of medicine and sociology because way back I studied medicine, I qualified in medicine, and then I decided to do some sociology as a hobby, really. But then eventually I became a professor of medicine and sociology. I was also interested in general practice, and I work in a department of general practice, and I qualified in general practice, and I worked closely over the last few decades with GPs. So I think I'm very well aware of what happens in general practice. And I also became a public health physician. I qualified in public health and became an academic public health physician. And I do research across those fields.
And in terms of your understanding of medical records, both now and previously, what sort of work have you done that's involved medical records?
Well, so my knowledge stems from some personal experience of medical records, both in hospital and general practice. It stems from conversations with clinical colleagues over the years, and it also stems from some of my research interests, which in part have looked at clinical records, examined clinical records, but also I've used extensively online clinical records to do research, secondary data analysis it's called.
And the secondary data analysis, I understand from your research, has been in quite large data sets of records.
Yes, so we collect 50,000 patients with a certain disease and compare them with 50,000 without that disease.
If we can start with the late 1950s and the Lloyd George system in general practice, can you help us with how that system in general practice operated very practically?
Yes, I think it was called the Lloyd George system because it was introduced with the 1911 National Insurance Act, where we still pay our national insurance contributions following that act. And this was a small A5-sized cardboard folder in which one placed cards of the patient's record. I think before the NHS, these were very infrequently used. They did exist because this was part of the panel system where the GPs got paid for looking after low-paid employees. And they used to write, this was the clinical record. And I remember when I was in general practice, our group practice merged with a neighbouring single-handed practitioner who'd retired, and all the records were delivered in a large box, just thrown into this box. And I remember looking through some of them, and all they had on would be one word. They'd say sore throat, headache, or something like that. Now, the reason for that is that this GP would have known all of his patients personally, and so in a way there was no need for that reminder of what this patient's past problems were, because they'd see them regularly and would understand what they were. So I think in those days of solo practice, it was very unusual to have comprehensive records because they simply weren't needed.
And in relation to hospital records, you refer in your report to the 1956 Ministry of Health guidance that records should be kept for 6 years after treatment and destroyed 3 years after the patient's death, but also that clinical records of historical importance should not be destroyed. Can you help us at all with what was considered to be a record of historical importance?
I think it was a very haphazard judgment. At that time, hospital records were pretty haphazard anyway, because every hospital had a separate system. Every hospital would store them differently, everyone would dispose of them differently, and so it would be made on a case-by-case basis. I suspect that if they found a record that told you something about the patient at the beginning of the century, somebody would have said, oh, that's historical. We should somehow keep that because it's got historical interest. But I don't think beyond that sort of subjective judgment there was any pattern to those decisions.
And it may be a similar answer, but who would make those decisions as to what would be kept and what wouldn't be?
I don't know who would make those decisions. Partly it would be clinicians who'd been involved in the patient's care, but it also could be the medical records officer. So every hospital had a huge department where all the medical records were stored, and these would be miles of folders all stacked up like in a very complex library, and they would have to be sort of filleted out now and again and pruned and removed, and somebody would have made that decision in the record office, but I don't know who it would have been.
And then can we pick up RLIT 301173, please? This is the 1965 Tunbridge report, the Central Health Services Council report called The Standardisation of Hospital Medical Records. Before we look at some particular passages, do you know how this report came about? I don't know exactly, but I presume it was because of the chaotic state of hospital records prior to that time. As I said, every hospital that joined the NHS in 1948 had a different system of storing records. And the Tunbridge report was an attempt to standardise those by using A4 folders, which is what, when I came in, A4 folders were a general part of hospital care. And if we pick up in page 9, I think it's page 9, internal page 6, thank you, just under the heading, the management of medical records. The case record of a patient is compiled from a number of different notes brought together in such a way as to give the doctor in charge of the case quickly accessible information about the patient at any time whilst the patient is in his care. This information reaches the record from his own notes and from a variety of other sources, from the family doctor, from the specialist diagnostic departments, from nurses, from relatives and from the social services. And then a little further down, anyone who's had to plough through hospital medical records in search of the currently relevant information about a patient will recognise the value of the good management of records, which ensures that those needed are in the correct place at the right time, yet will admit how rarely this is achieved in most hospitals today. You've mentioned a moment ago that part of the problem was that different hospitals had different systems, and in the expert report you've referred to record keeping being chaotic and varied. Other than the different hospitals having different systems, what were the other factors causing that chaos and variation? I think I can summarise with the Tunbridge report and a number of other reports following those from the Audit Commission and so on about the state of hospital records, that they have always been rather chaotic, and they probably still are. And the reason is that, first of all, there's meant to be one record for every patient,
But if a patient is admitted to hospital and then goes home and comes back as an outpatient, the notes should somehow appear in the outpatient department on the appointed day to meet the patient. But this was very difficult to organise, and sometimes one of the outpatient consultants would keep the notes, think, oh, the patient's coming back in a week, we'll keep these notes till they come back. But in the meantime, the patient might have been needed in another clinic or have another admission, and the notes weren't there. So lots of patients had lots of sets of notes that were circulating in the hospital under these different consultants, and now and again an attempt would be to pull them all together into a unified system, but it depends on how many visits the patient was making. If they were making a lot of visits, it became very, very difficult to carry through these notes to follow the patient. So there were lots of different notes. For some patients, particularly those with multiple illnesses, they got very thick. So I've seen notes 2 or 3 inches thick with all the notes, which is the clinical record, which is all the investigation records, which is all the letters from GPs, from social workers, and so on, all in those notes. And it became impossible to find. So you pick up one of these 3-inch documents and say, what's wrong with this patient? Well, it would take you many hours to find that out. So there were various attempts over the years to prune these notes, to get it down to the essential elements of this patient's clinical history. But of course, that took a lot of time. Somebody had to take time off from their clinical work to actually fillet these notes down, prune them down to something much more focused. So a lot of the time it didn't happen. And when it did happen, it was up to the clinician who was doing that pruning to decide what was important and what was not important. So sometimes I'm sure important records got disposed of because they didn't seem important, whereas others were retained. So when we talk about a retention policy over time, it's already being messed around by that pruning process and by the fact that different notes appeared at different points of time in the patient's journey through the NHS.
And in terms of what that might mean for somebody who is seeking their records to establish what treatment they've received, or if they've received a blood transfusion or certain blood products, what are the implications of that for them?
They may be lucky and they might find them, but there's a number of factors which would militate against them actually finding them. First of all, there is the retention policies. They've always had a retention policy which has been between 8 and 10 years after the patient's death. The notes would be retained before being destroyed. There was also the same thing, was that either 8 or 10 years after the last course of treatment. Now, that's a slightly odd idea nowadays when people have chronic illnesses. When is the last course of treatment? Because you might have diabetes and then you're discharged from hospital. Does the hospital then destroy those notes? You've still got diabetes and you may well come back with complications of diabetes in 10, 15 years' time. So it was really odd, it seems to me, to destroy notes prematurely when they might be needed by patients, by the clinicians. So that's partly the problem, is that. And then, of course, what is in those notes? Every department seemed to have different policies with regard what was in the notes. What was in the obstetric notes would be very different from what was in the psychiatrist's notes, which would be very different from what's in the haematologist's notes. They'd have different coloured papers to signify which specialty was looking after the patient. But again, when somebody was pruning those notes, which of those coloured pages were retained and which weren't is anybody's guess. So that when things were pruned, things were lost, and so some of those notes are an edited version of the full notes. And the other phenomenon, I'm sure we'll come on to, is the ability of hospitals to lose notes. It is notoriously difficult to keep notes in hospitals. They always get lost. And one of the interesting experiments that about 20 or 30 years ago, they got patients in antenatal care to carry their own notes. And one of the great triumphs of that experiment was that none of the notes were lost because the patients were looking after them. But when the doctors were looking after them, when the hospital was looking after them, notes got lost. Again, it was between one clinic and another clinic, and sometimes they'd end up in the back of the consultant's car because he wanted to take them home to write some notes or do an audit or something. They just got lost. So the system was not designed to maintain notes as a sort of as a top priority.
We mentioned retention periods. If we could just pick that up in the Tunbridge report. 1965. If we turn 2 pages on, please, Lawrence. Under the heading Medical Records Proper, it reads, information relating to previous admission to or attendance at hospital is of great importance to the management of the case when the patient requires further treatment in hospital. All the relevant information ought to be available, but if it's filed with a mass of documents containing information no longer relevant, the task of every person who looks at the record is made unnecessarily complicated every time he picks up the document. I think that's a point you were just making. Yeah. There's also the practical problem that storage space for records is necessarily limited, and we were told frequently that the storage of records was a serious and ever-growing problem. Circular HM 6173, which is current guidance on the preservation and destruction of medical records, gives for the life of a medical record a minimum period of 6 years after conclusion of treatment or 3 years after death of a patient. So that's 1965 in terms of the retention period. It's slightly different in relation to psychiatric records. And if we just turn the page, we found in practice that the majority of consultants do not agree to the destruction of medical records at all, and therefore, although the HM circular pointed out that microfilming was uneconomic, a considerable number of hospitals had been forced to microfilm records in order to release space. So it's perhaps worth flagging now that tomorrow in the presentation on medical records, I will be going through the changes to the retention periods over time. So there'll be a fuller explanation there of retention periods. But just in relation to here in 1965 and this reference to microfilming, the inquiry has heard evidence from several witnesses who've been told that their records had been transferred to microfilm or microfiche. Are you familiar at all with that process?
I know what it means, but I've never seen a microfiched record. I think it was probably unusual for that to happen because it's resources. You've got to imagine these medical records departments. I was reading that it's at the Norfolk Hospital, where the 700-bed hospital had 30,000 new records every year to add to what was being stored. So it was a major undertaking to manage these new records coming in, and the records had to go out to the various clinics and inpatient departments throughout the hospital. So I think this was enough without getting too involved in the minutiae of sometimes policy was stated, but the practice on the ground, I think, was often very different.
And thinking about that policy and practice distinction, here we've got retention periods of 6 years or 3 years after death. But we've got a practice that suggests that wasn't really happening at all. Can you shed any light on that?
Well, it would not happen in practice because, first of all, some of them would be disposed of earlier because they were lost. Some of them they would follow the guidance because somebody was very efficient about it. But most of the time, I think records departments were really hard pressed just to manage the flow of records in and out of the department and to the different bits of the hospital. So that was a major undertaking. And the records officer had therefore to go through them and find out when was the last. So they're all arranged in alphabetical order because you've got to find the patient for the clinic. And you've got to go through all these notes and you've got to find out which ones where the last treatment was 6 years ago or 8 years ago. That was a very, very difficult task. So I don't think the organisation and the cataloguing of the notes was enabled anyone really to follow these instructions, this guidance.
The Tunbridge report recommended some standardisation of medical records, and I think that was to make them all A4 yes. and folders that were standardised.
Yes.
But you say in the expert report that records continued to be a jumble of different sections that struggled to encompass all the clinical care delivered to the patient. Removing what was considered extraneous material happened on a haphazard basis. What was your understanding of how widespread that haphazard approach was?
Everywhere. Yes. I can't think how it could have been organised any differently, because the only way to be non-haphazard is someone had to take responsibility for the pruning of the notes and getting it down to the core clinical problem that the patient faced. And that was a big undertaking for some patients with enormous amounts of notes. It would have taken a clinician, 3 hours to whittle down to the core bits of a patient's note. And that clinician needed those 3 hours to see current patients. So there just wasn't the time or the inclination, I think, to follow a lot of this guidance. It just couldn't be followed.
And you said it was haphazard everywhere. Are you aware of whether it was particularly bad in particular specialties, or was it just across the board in all specialties in all hospitals?
My guess would be across the board in all specialties. And the other thing to remember is every hospital had its own record, so if a patient went to 2 hospitals or 3 hospitals, which was not unusual, then they'd have 3 sets of notes, which were completely separate. And also when hospitals merged, they had to merge these medical records departments. And again, it just increased the problem, the likelihood that notes would go missing and things wouldn't be followed through. I think just as the nature of medical records, you remember they started off as a sort of an aide-memoire, as a sort of memory for the clinician to see the individual patient. And over the last few decades, the role of the record has changed incredibly, because now it isn't the individual clinician who's got to be reminded of what this problem was, it's the whole clinical team. So it's a means of communicating between the clinical team. The sorts of problems the patients are presenting with used to be fairly acute, short term, and now we get multiple problems over a longer term. And finally, there is the sort of changing relationship between the doctor and patient from a rather paternalistic system towards a more shared care model. And so again, the function of the record has changed over time. So although we call it the clinical record, it is a very different phenomenon today compared with what it was 50 years ago.
I wonder if I may just ask a couple of questions. The first is, what the Tunbridge report is talking about here is medical records.
Yes.
To what extent does that include nursing records of inpatient care?
I don't think it would. So the nurses kept their own records, separate records. The physiotherapist would keep their own records. The occupational therapist would keep their own records. So when we talk about clinical records, these are medical records.
It's been, I think, a general experience of those who've practiced in the area of clinical negligence that the nurses' records, nursing nursing cardex, as it used to be called, could be much more informative,
Yes.
very often, than the admitting doctor's notes, and then the treating doctor's notes, and then the various observations from time to time. Not least because the consultant might, as it were, swan in and swan out, and the more junior doctor be responsible for care, etc. And that no doubt would create its own problems.
Yes, I'm afraid I don't know what happened to nursing records, whether they were stored as well. I'm afraid I don't know.
And the same would go presumably for fluid charts and diagnostic materials?
All of those things were at the end of the bed, would be the temperature chart, the fluid chart and everything, and they would be stored with part of the nursing record, I think, but what happened to them, I don't know.
And was it the case that some outpatients would keep their own outpatient records and they were separate from the inpatient records at the same hospital?
Yes, it's true. That's why the several sets of notes for the same patient could circulate in the hospital and they'd be kept separate. So every new patient coming into an A&E would automatically have a new record opened, even though they'd been in the hospital 10 times before. They wouldn't retrieve, because they didn't have the time to retrieve their record from the record office if they were being seen in A&E. So a new record was opened. And I guess the intention was that these should be merged. Now, whether they always were, there's a lot of chance there.
And I suppose if someone comes into A&E and is admitted for treatment, the notes from the A&E triage ought to go with the patient.
They should, and they should be merged with the patient's existing clinical record.
Do they, as a matter of course?
Well, that's the problem, that sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't, because the notes were often, new notes were set up very often because they couldn't find the record. So you go to the dermatology clinic, they can't find the record, so the dermatologist opens a new set of records. These circulate in the hospital, and sometimes they go to the rheumatology clinic, and therefore they pick up the dermatologist's past record, but not the inpatient record. So there's a number of records circulating in the hospital, and it was very difficult for one person to sort of say how these all should be brought together, because the records officer simply had to file them in that great big cavernous warehouse where all these records were being stored. And it wasn't their job really to do that sort of clinical integration and pruning.
And if let us suppose that somebody admitted for inpatient treatment, in the view of the treating doctor, requires a transfusion, the doctor will presumably notify the hospital blood bank and say, I need so many units of whatever it is, and the blood bank will make a record of that somewhere in their records.
Yes.
They won't be married up, presumably, with the patient record.
No, they wouldn't be, though it should be in the patient record that they received a transfusion.
Yes. Is that always, again, the case?
I would imagine receiving a transfusion would be in the clinical record, as that was quite a significant clinical event. Transfusions weren't that common, and when they did occur, then there could be all sorts of consequences from the transfusion. So I think I would have hoped that most of the time they would be in the clinical record.
And that would then depend upon how that clinical record was handled thereafter, whether it was in due course destroyed after treatment, after so many years, or whether it was lost,
Indeed.
etc., etc.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Following on from those questions and your answers earlier about culling or weeding case notes, what was intended by that? What sort of documents would be expected to be removed in a culling process?
Well, it was for the next clinician who saw that patient to be able to quickly summarise what was the patient's clinical history, what was their past diseases they'd suffered from, what was the treatments they'd had in the past, and what were the treatments they were currently on. And there was a move in the 1990s from the US, in fact, was called problem-oriented medical records. So the idea that the front page of every medical record should simply list the key problems that the patient had. So there's a list of the diseases, a list of problem areas, and so any clinician could open the folder, and there in front of them would be that list. So there was an attempt to develop that that would be the mid-late 1990s, but again it required a lot of time and effort. Somebody had to go through these notes, summarising and pulling out, often from different specialties, what was the patient's underlying problems. And I think although one or two enthusiasts did it quite well, most of the clinical workforce didn't have the time to do that.
And just thinking about the culling of case notes, the inquiries had heard evidence that transfusions were sometimes put into something like the fluid balance charts or the prescription charts, rather than the chronological clinical notes. If there was a cull of case notes, would you anticipate that that might include something like a fluid balance chart or a prescription chart would be removed?
Yeah, yes. I mean, very often the people doing this culling would be junior doctors who, they were available. They could be instructed to cull, prune some of these notes. That's your job tonight, junior. Go off and do that. And here's 10 notes. Can you pull them down to a reasonable size? And so that would be a junior's judgment about what was important for the future care of that patient. And I guess at the time, having a transfusion, if it didn't have any immediate consequences, because there could be immediate consequences with mismatching and so on, you had to be aware of that. But I guess a few years after the transfusion, then the interest in that transfusion was considerably less. And so that could well have been culled.
And from your answer, I think it follows that then there wasn't any particular consistency or guidance on what should and shouldn't be removed.
No. Because every patient's notes were very different. It was very difficult to give a standard of what should and shouldn't be in there, even today.
Earlier today you referred to the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital with 762 beds, creating some 30,000 new files every year. I just want to pick that up from the journal article itself, which addresses some other points as well. RLIT 301704, please. It's a British Medical Journal article from January 1985. It sets out at the beginning of the article the guidance in 1985, which are with slightly different retention periods, which is the 8-year minimum period. And then the bottom of the first column says this. For various reasons, many hospital clinical records have survived beyond these minimum retention periods. Their storage, however, is causing immense problems, and these are becoming more acute as hospitals close down or find that the space taken by clinical records is not effective. And then there's the example of the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. This concern led in 1977 to a one-day conference at the King's Fund Centre, which found that the threat to medical records was, if anything, more serious than had been assumed, and concluded that the danger to medical records was so great that it wasn't possible to rely on long-term action by central authorities to amend and enforce official guidelines. I just want to pick up from there the point about hospitals closing down. Some other evidence that the inquiry has heard, particularly around maternity hospitals, is that women who were treated there have struggled to get their notes because the hospitals have closed down. Can you assist us at all with what happens with the records when a hospital closes down?
Well, they would be transferred to the hospital. Hospitals don't close, they merge. And I think they would be merged with whichever hospital they were notionally merging with. So that would be where they went, where the notes would go. I mean, it's possible they're just thrown into a skip, but I would imagine that they would go into this new hospital. But the twin hospital with which it was merging, but what that new hospital did with the notes from that old hospital that had closed is anyone's guess, because again there's a huge storage problem. So you're already packed in all your shelves with clinical notes, and then suddenly a few 100,000 more arrive. What do you do with them? And I don't think anybody knows what happened to them, but clearly was a bit of an incentive then to get rid of them.
And we then pick up, if we may, the Audit Commission report, RLIT 301172. It's from 1995, called Setting the Records Straight. And if we turn to page 9, please. We have a summary of this chapter on the left. Case notes are complex documents that need a clear structure. While some are satisfactory, others have major flaws. Too many are fat, cluttered and untidy and should be culled and sorted periodically. Many hospitals keep more than one set of case notes per person, making coordination of care difficult. Coding of data to produce information for research, planning and the contracting process needs to be more accurate. And then page 22, please. Medical records departments provide case notes to clinicians on request and retrieve them for storage when an episode of care is completed. The first task is to find the case notes. Some will be in the library, others will not be on the shelves, but found eventually, and a few will not be found at all, jeopardising care. A proper system for tracing and tracking case notes is required. Closed libraries appear to have fewer case notes not traced out. Libraries need systematic procedures with overcrowding reduced through a combination of culling, the process of removing unwanted material from case notes, and weeding, the removal of whole case notes from the system for archiving, for example, if the patient is dead. Many hospitals have more than one main library, which complicates matters. Finally, unless case notes are stored and moved under a proper set of arrangements, the security and confidentiality of the information they hold can be put at risk. So this is relatively, it might be said, late in the piece, 1995, but it appears that the problems were still ongoing. Can you help us in relation to this passage on the screen? What is meant by a closed library? And why that might be that there were fewer case notes not traced out from those?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know what you weren't allowed to take the case notes out. Yeah, it's absurd. You've got to be able to take the case notes out because you've got to write in them the latest episode of care. So I'm not sure what a closed library is.
And the other part of this page where there's the discussion at the top that medical records departments provide case notes to clinicians on request and retrieve them for storage. Practically, how were case notes retrieved? Was it for the clinician to return them?
Yes,
or...
it was for the clinician to return them.
So it was entirely reliant on the doctor saying, I'm finished with this, thank you, it can go back.
Exactly. And if the doctor decided, I might need this again in a few days, and if I don't keep it, someone else will grab it, they would keep it themselves, and hence the other clinic couldn't then get access to the notes. So it was entirely up to the clinician.
There's a health service circular in March 1999, but I'll look at that tomorrow within the chronology. We then come to the introduction of computerised records, particularly in general practice. Yeah. When computerisation was brought into general practice, was that just a forward-looking exercise, or was there also an exercise to undertake and to digitise historic records?
I think it was a bit of both. For a while, the two systems ran alongside each other, so the GP would have the Lloyd George folder on their desk and the computer, and they did it. And I guess while they were looking through it, they might have transferred some stuff to the computer. But again, it was a considerable undertaking if you've got 10,000 patients in a group practice on a list. What the average size at that time would have been about 10,000 patients in a group practice. That was a lot of notes to go through to transfer onto the digital system. So I think they ran alongside each other, but very quickly GPs realised the efficiencies of using computerised data. Partly because things didn't get lost, everything was in one place, and different members of the healthcare team could access those notes at different times.
And you say in the report that these notes rely heavily on structured medical codes
Yes.
rather than free text. Can you explain for us what you mean by that?
Yes. It means that if a patient has a diagnosis, they've got a diagnosis of pneumonia or they've got a diagnosis of diabetes, instead of writing in diabetes or this patient could have diabetes, you've got to put in a code, which would be, I don't know what it would be, it might be RD41, might be the code for diabetes. So there's a code, the computer would then store that code. So lots of things were coded with a diagnosis because there was a coding scheme. You start to type in diabetes and RD14, whatever it is, would appear, and you put that in the box. So most diagnoses were and are coded nowadays, and that's, I said at the outset, some of my research. I wanted to find 50,000 patients with colorectal cancer. I just had to ask for that code, and all those patients would then appear in the database. So that was the coded, and then there's a section called free text, where the GP could write whatever they want. Now, obviously, that requires a bit more effort, because coding, you're just ticking boxes, and there's a number of things you can tick boxes for: the diagnosis, the prescription, the investigations. There's a number of things you can tick boxes for. But if you want to listen to a patient's miseries and problems, if it was life, well, there wasn't a box for that. So you either had to use free text or you ignored it. So there's been some criticism of the notes, the way they codify the case record. It doesn't allow that human element, which is often people say is very important for general practice.
And I'm asked to ask you, have you done any work, or are you aware of any work having been done about how accurate GP records now are? Depends what accuracy means,
yes.
But in terms of recording, say, medication that's been given or tests that have been undertaken, things that can be measured.
Yes, I think they're probably quite good. I can't think of any studies that have done it, because partly what are you comparing it against? You've got to have a gold standard of this is a really accurate record and this is yours, and it isn't up to the mark. But who's going to have that perfect record? So I'm not sure it would be there, but it's in the GP's interests to put down all the prescriptions. Well, in fact, the prescriptions would automatically go in, because one of the things the electronic health record did very quickly was to allow automatic prescriptions. So you just press the button and the prescription would be printed out. And that was a far easier way for the GP to prescribe. So I think almost all prescriptions were one of the first things to go into the electronic health record were all the prescriptions. So they would all be there. And the same for a lot of the investigations, because the investigations, if you wanted to send the patient for a blood test, you tick the box and that request would be automatically sent. So in a way, I think most of that clinical care, as long as it could be put in a box, most of that clinical care was well recorded.
Computerisation in hospitals didn't follow until the new millennium.
Yeah.
Why was there that delay?
GP, first of all, British GPs, I think, were the first in the world to computerise. So British primary care was the first big sector of healthcare anywhere in the world to computerise. And that was because I think a number of vendors got into that space and offered them systems where they could set up on their PCs in the practice, and they could use it for general practice. And there are now 3 or 4 systems now you can buy from the suppliers, which you can use to digitise your practice. Hospitals, they had to start from scratch. They didn't seem to be the same vendors with this systematic system, because in a way every hospital ran itself differently. And as I said before, all these different specialties had different requirements. And so the chemical pathology department just had a lot of, I don't want to do them down, but I think they had a lot of box ticking, whereas the psychiatrists would have a long spiel of free text because they had to listen to what the patient said before they could make a diagnosis. So the requirements of different departments in the hospital required different sort of spaces in this digital space, which was going to be the electronic health record. So I think every hospital has done it differently, which means that there is difficulty of interrelating between general practice and the hospital, because the records can't be communicated directly, and also between different hospitals, because they've often got different systems. So there is a problem of, they call it interoperability between these different sections of the healthcare system. Especially if a hospital had a particular interest in maternity, for example, they would have a different sort of system than one which was mainly mental health. So you can understand why they might have different systems.
I want to come to that interoperability in just one moment, but before I do, you say in the report that the effort involved in digitising records means that records were kept in paper and digital form. What does that mean practically when trying to get a full picture of someone's medical history?
Yeah, difficult, I think, is the answer, because you have to. So you've got to imagine the clinic, the hospital consultant, either in the clinic or on the ward. They've got an immediate problem in front of them. They've got to solve. They've got to make a diagnosis. They've got to decide on investigations and treatments. And sometimes the previous history of the patient is important, and sometimes it isn't. And it depends what the problem is. So if a patient is in a road traffic accident, well, maybe it's not important that they've got a history in the dermatology department of having dermatitis or something. It might not be as important. So the immediate problem is done digitally, but the consultant would then refer to the paper copy, which would be next to them, for anything which might be relevant to the current problem. So that's the way it would work. So I can't tell you how often they were both referred to, but obviously over time the paper copy was gradually replaced by the digital copy.
With the introduction of digital records, do you think that the existence of the paper records might have become more problematic? By that I mean, do you think there might have been a greater loss of paper records because of the reliance on digital records?
Yeah, I would imagine it's quite probable. They would be running down the medical records departments, and it takes a lot of space, it takes a lot of staff, and in terms of hospital efficiencies, the quicker that can be closed, the better it is for the functioning of the hospital. So there must have been pressures to reduce use of paper and to deprioritise it, and so those paper records might well have been lost more frequently at that handover time.
And just returning to the interoperability question, can you help us with how hospitals with a digital system interact with GPs, first of all?
There is a lot of things happen electronically. For example, if a GP orders a blood test, this will go to the hospital haematology department, who will carry out the test, and the results will be fed back to the GP electronically. So the GP will get every day, every week, they'll get a whole list of all the patients who've sent for a blood test with the results. But of course the GPs have got to set up a system to check through all of those results, and usually it's one GP takes that responsibility on, and just look through and see any of these are of concern, where the patient needs to be brought back, or they just simply filed away in the patient's own notes. So there's good communication at that level of requesting tests and having the tests fed back. There are also some ability in some places for the GP to see the hospital record. They can go into the hospital system and see the record, but they can't add to it or alter it or anything, but they can see components of the record if it's important. But remember, a GP should be in possession of everything that's happened in the hospital should have been reported back to the GP. So there will be letters from in the old system, there would be paper letters which would be filed in this folder from the hospital consultant to say, I saw your patient who's got diabetes and I treated them with this, that and t'other, and I think you should continue this treatment. So that would be stored in the patient's record. And in the electronic record, that email letter would also be stored in the GP's electronic record. So the communication is good in terms of digitally, but the systems are different.
But in terms of storing those letters, does that rely on someone in the GP surgery uploading them onto the system?
Yes.
So there's still a human element required?
Yes.
And then in terms of the interoperability between hospitals or between a hospital and, say, a hospice or the district health teams, how does that work?
I'm afraid I don't know the details of that, but because they have different systems, I don't know whether, for example, the district nurses can access the hospital record or not. I'm afraid.
That's fine. And as we stand today, how much progress has the digitisation of records brought to the accuracy and the state of medical records?
I think it's a difficult one because digitisation allows you to store everything. And the problem with storing everything is you can't find what you're interested in. So once everything is stored and you look around this, instead of these fat folder patients, they've got gigabytes of data, which is their clinical record. And actually finding your way through that, because it doesn't get pruned, because it's so easy to store, it just accumulates. So some of these digital records are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, whether that is, I suppose the record is always there to look back, and there are search facilities and so on to look back, but whether that has improved care, in that sense, I'm not so sure. But what it has done is allow all members of the healthcare team to look at that record, and that's important. Nowadays, medicine isn't delivered by individuals, it's delivered by teams. And so all the teams can look, members of the team can look at it, either in the general practice team or the hospital team can all look at the same record, and they're all singing off the same hymn sheet, so to speak. It also has facilitated patient access, which if you want to come on to, I think patient access has been facilitated by having digital records.
We'll come on to patient access almost immediately. One question before we do. I've been asked to ask you what you think could be done to improve the state of records as they currently stand.
I'm not sure. The thing that you've got to think about the purpose of the record, and the purpose of the record is constantly changing. So if I told you what the perfect record is today, in 10 years' time, it would not be appropriate. And the things that I've mentioned have changed. We moved from solo practice to team practice, so the record must now act as a communication medium between members of the team, which it didn't have to do 50 years ago, because there was usually only one clinician looking after that patient at a time. So that's changed. In the past, patients used to have fairly acute, short-term conditions. It's a bit of a generalization, but nowadays, especially with an aging population, we have multiple problems. Patients with multiple problems, extremely common, with multiple, especially the elderly, with lots of problems. And again, the records have got to cope with that, which is a new challenge for them. And then there's the interoperability, which we discussed, which again remains a challenge. So, I'm not an expert on, I'm sitting here, I'm not an expert on records, and I really don't know what the nirvana of the future is. But
I want to move on then to access to medical records. You've described in the expert report that access to medical records was only really developed in the 1980s with the advent of freedom of information and data protection legislative provisions. With the advent of that access, what issues arose for clinicians and for patients?
Well, first of all, for clinicians, they were rather shocked because they'd say things in the record which were sometimes unfortunate, they were sometimes rude, they were sometimes damning of the patient. So sometimes they would be quite cruel. I've seen quite cruel comments in records by clinicians who maybe had a bad day and they'd say some things about patients. But I've also seen things in medical records which would be, I remember reading a GP record said, I've seen this woman, she is a rather grey woman, which was describing her demeanour as grey. Now, I think I knew what that GP meant when I read that, but would the patient have understood that in the same way? So there are issues about the interpretation of the words the doctors are using. And then there's the issue of that there may be things that the doctor doesn't want the patient to know, and there are two categories there, really. First of all, are those where there's a third party involved. If there is a patient comes in who's depressed, well, the GP sort of might want to put in the spouse's notes that their partner is depressed, because that might have a bearing on what they're presenting with. So there are often things in patients' notes referring to other people, which in a way you can't give access to patients to for that sort of thing. And then there are some things where there might be a tentative diagnosis where it's judged best not to tell the patient at that time. And that would sometimes occur, but it would be in the notes, or even that, I must see the patient, I must inform the patient next time I see them that this is the diagnosis. That would be in the notes, but somebody sees the patient, if the patient then gets access to it before that conversation, there's a problem. And then, of course, the patient reading the notes, a lot of this is complex medical terminology, and the patient often needs somebody with them to explain what is in the notes. So again, that can be a challenge for patients as well.
And the expert report describes that the first response to the legislation that gradually gave patients the right to see their records was to start writing more sanitised notes. And the second was to edit and censor older records, which was a time-consuming business.
Yes.
How extensive do you think was the editing and censoring process?
Well, I think patient access to notes really took a decade or so before it was happening. So I think clinicians were primed to begin to write more clearly, more sanitised. It's like your personal emails. If you knew your personal emails were going to be read by the world, you might not say some of the things about your auntie that you would otherwise say in your personal email. So it was the same thing in the medical records. I think doctors just started to sanitise, be more careful about what they would write in the record. And I think that applies today. And perhaps there's been some loss on account of that. Sometimes you want to communicate something to the rest of the team about a patient, but whatever you wanted to say, the patient could misconstrue or see it as stigmatising or see it as damning when it wasn't intended to be, but it's just simply a communication to the rest of the team. Okay, this patient is very depressed. I want to put that in and communicate it to the rest of the team. And the patient might not have been happy about that. So you've got to judge about what you actually enter in the notes these days, given the patient may have access. Or at least but again, what they have access to, given this complicated notes I've described, which bits do they have access to? Do they have access to the codes? Do they have access to the free text? Do they have access to advice on what these codes mean, and so on? So it is a complicated process for the patients nowadays.
And in relation to that second element that was noted in the expert report of censoring and amending historic notes, what's your view of how extensive that was?
As I said, I think it was probably fairly minimal, because they just realised they weren't writing for themselves, they were writing for a wider audience. And so over a 10-year period, as that patient access movement gathered pace, over that 10-year period, I think the notes were increasingly sanitised.
In terms of the benefits of access to record or disbenefits, can I just go to two journal papers and then
Yes.
ask you about it? RLIT 301710. It's an article from the British Journal of General Practice in June 2007, headed Patient Record Access, the Time Has Come. And if we turn the page to the second page, we're just going to pick up at the bottom of the first column and go on to the second. Clinicians' reactions. Clinicians are often initially sceptical and worried about the impact of record access. They fear that mistakes and confusion will be exposed and that litigation may increase. However, there is no evidence for this. On the contrary, evidence is clear that record access improves relationships between clinicians and patients. Experience with record access tends to convince clinicians that its benefits outnumber its potential problems. Benefits of record access. The benefits of record access appear to be substantial. Patients describe improved trust and confidence in their clinicians, and they feel more informed and in control of their condition and its management. There is some evidence for improved health practices by patients. For example, improved compliance in heart failure and improved cigarette quit rates have been demonstrated. In general, patients are keen on record access in principle and in practice. Record access can increase safety by alerting the practice to any recording errors. Furthermore, patients can save time for practices and themselves by looking in their records for information rather than asking reception. And then a second paper, RLIT 301706, again from the British Journal of General Practice, March 2015, patients' online access to their electronic health records and linked online services, a systematic review in primary care. And if we could turn to, I think it's page 8, please. The heading discussion and summary. And it says users of online access and services report increased satisfaction in terms of better self-care and communication with clinicians. Online access and services also positively impacted on patient safety, especially when patients are given access to medication lists and are offered prevention or health maintenance reminders. But there is then a note about disparity in who accesses online records and some discussion of some limitations. Would that be your experience as well from your research and from your discussion with clinicians that access to records for patients is broadly positive?
Yes, there were those initial reservations about it, but as I said earlier, what is a clinical record? Its purpose has changed, and now the clinical record becomes part of the mechanism through which you can have shared care, shared decision-making with the doctor and the patient. So when that happens, you do get better compliance, you get better satisfaction, the patient gets a better deal. But that's because the nature of the record has changed and it is this medium for sharing between doctor and patient. I might add that I'm not sure that many patients actually do request it, but when they do, all the results are positive, as we've seen. But also I think it has led to the doctors also thinking about the patient, seeing the record as something that is shared much more than it used to be. It used to be their own personal memorandum for the future, and now it is a shared document. And I think the function's changed, and all the evidence is that it's beneficial to both parties.
In your report, you've then discussed the NHS digital strategy of Connecting for Health and the 2010 Department of Health's vision of an information revolution for practices. That's addressed fully in the report. But what are your views on the ongoing challenges to accessing medical records? What are the difficulties that remain?
Well, partly is getting the actual access and the security around that. So who can get access to what? And is it the patient executors after the patient's died? Can they get access to the record? Can the patient's family the parents get access, and so on? So who gets access, and what are the security measures around that? So it can't be hacked or whatever, anybody can get access to it. So I think there are problems around giving that access. And then when you've got the access, do you get access to all of the record? This is general practice. I'm much more familiar with general practice. But obviously in hospital, it would be how much of the record do you get access to? Because it could be a huge volume. And then do you need support in making sense of it? And again, that is a resource-intensive business, to sit with a patient and go through and explain what everything is. But as I said before, I think it's the record reflects a change in the doctor-patient relationship, so there's shared decision-making now, And the fact that the GP or the clinician is writing the record for both parties means that the GP, the doctor, should be explaining to the patient what is going on. It isn't sufficient to say, you've got this, you must take this treatment. There now needs to be a discussion of the diagnosis, of its implications, and what the treatment is and the treatment side effects. So I think that is general accepted now, that is what should be happening in the consultation between doctor and patient. And in a way, the new record reflects that. Even if you don't have to access it, the record reflects the fact it is a joint decision-making document.
And one final point you highlight in the report, that the system of record access, it remains something of a patchwork, because there is still a system of GP electronic systems and hospital systems which are separate.
Yes, indeed. And every hospital will have a slightly different system. And so when you get permission to see the hospital record, I don't know how this actually works, but who decides which bit you see? If you want to see your record in the obstetric department, can you also see the record in the dermatology department, in the psychiatry department? Does that give you access to all bits of the record or only segments of it? In general practice, do you get access to the free text, all these notes that have been written about you, or just to the coded information, such as the diagnosis and what treatment you've been under?
Thank you, Professor. Those are the questions I had for Professor Armstrong, but I'm conscious we need to take a brief break to see if there are further questions from the recognised legal representatives.
Yes, well, we'll do that. How long do you think you might need?
I don't anticipate needing very long. Perhaps 15 minutes would suffice.
Well, let's say not before 3:30. If it's longer than that, of course, it's longer than that, and we'll let the Professor know. Professor, this is a break in evidence. You're under oath. You mustn't discuss the evidence you've given or anything that you may yet feel you might be asked about with anyone, whoever they are, but you can talk about anything else you like.
Okay, thank you very much.
And not before 3:30. That's because those who are core participants have a right to think what questions they may want to ask you through counsel about what you've been talking. Not before 3:30.